We're going to wrap up the day by having what are called in the program first respondents. The assumption is that there'll be second respondents, but I don't think there will be formally here in the forum because of our time. And so we're going to invite the four people over now to come and join us up here on the couch. That'd be quite cosy, four people on that couch. This is Amy. Amy Austin is a teacher at Island Bay School, where she's a team leader and the literacy coordinator, and seems to have had quite an interesting number of experiences in your short teaching career by comparison to mine. No, they don't want to sit too close. Well, that's all right. Just take a seat. I'm going to introduce all of you at once. Would you like to come up and join us on? Sitting next to Amy is Liz Horgan, and a number of you will know Liz. She's an absolutely wonderful person, a great advocate for good sense, good practice, for teachers, for children, everything really. And Liz is the principal of St Joseph's School, Otahuhu. It's not Otahu, it's Otahuhu. I was once told by a bus driver. She's been there since 1992. Then we have JC Couture, who's rather special really because he has come all the way from Alberta in Canada, specifically for this conference. JC, I mean, that's quite a high-sounding title, JC. JC coordinates the research activities of the Alberta Teachers Association in the province of Alberta. And Barry Potter, I know what you're thinking, but it's not, it's Barry. Barry Potter is a learning facilitator with the Centre for Educational Development at Massey University. And it's quite nice to know that we've still got at least one university that's still got an Education Development Centre in operation. So we're going to invite each of you in turn to give your response, your thoughts, your reactions, your ideas, your contribution to today's first day of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ko tangi te keo te maunga, ko tapu te ranga te moana, no whanganui a tara ahau, ko Amy Austin taku ingoa. Firstly, I'd like to thank Martin and Bob, wherever you are. I've really enjoyed listening to you today. I began as a beginning teacher here in Wellington at Island Bay School, and then I taught at Wadestown School, and then I went over and spent a short time teaching in India for a term, and then in London for 3 years, and then returned to New Zealand where I now teach at Island Bay School. While I was listening today, I thought a lot about some of my experiences while teaching in London, thinking about that continuum of where different different countries are being influenced by germ. The school that I taught at, our head teacher had been employed similarly to what was spoken about today on the basis of her data analysis ability, certainly not her personal skills. And I remember I was running some professional development for the staff about teaching reading, and I wanted to begin by asking people to talk about what they were already doing and their strengths and what was already going on in classrooms. And she said, no, you need to tell them what to do. Don't listen to them. I remember also my role in the school was working with lots of different groups of students, and I was placed in Year 6 in preparing for the standard achievement tests. And I remember working with groups of children who would talk about, I'm level 4, I'm level 3 in terms of their maths or their writing. And I often would try and say, well, actually, you aren't. Maybe that particular piece of writing was, or that particular piece of learning you did that day, but don't define yourself, because actually it depends so often on what you've actually done. I also saw children who were very disconnected from learning, who didn't trust the adults who were teaching them because school was boring, teachers were stressed, influenced by pressure from head teachers and boroughs about targets and results. And there wasn't really much intrinsic motivation. We got to the SATs, and then afterwards the teachers really did say, oh, so what should we teach them now? So for me it was a real breath of fresh air returning to New Zealand, and I think while we've been talking about some of the problems today, I was so happy to return to somewhere where I could teach in the way that I believe in, and to work with children who are happy, problem solvers, who are collaborative. And I think one of the strengths of New Zealand is that because we're a small country, unlike my experiences in the UK, I think here we can treat people as individuals. We can see the individual and the local and not have to kind of pull back and treat people as units or, you know, products of the industrial society, say, rather than that kind of standardisation, which sadly I think that germ movement is moving towards. I think we can focus on personalisation, and that we see children here as messy, and they've got sharp edges, and they're creative and unique. So those are some of the things I still value about our New Zealand system, and I think that's emphasised by the New Zealand curriculum, and also the way that schools are encouraged to then create our own curricula, which is made in consultation with the community. And I think when we were listening to the idea about the Learning Commission, which is taking ideas from different stakeholders, I can see how that could fit within that system that we already have. And I think that's something that could be, we were talking about this at my table, we'd love to see something like that happening at a national level, but then also locally, so that all stakeholders and experts were listened to rather than policy being quite so ideologically driven. I really like the idea about complexifying issues, and that the sound bites that we often hear on the news completely simplify very deep issues that take a lot of thinking. I also liked the sort of theme I heard about moving away from an overconfidence in assessment, that yes, assessment is important, but so often some of what is most important in life can't be quantified, and I think teachers know that. Yeah, some things I'm going to take away personally and think about in my school and in my classroom are the idea about lifting our eyes from the cart to the road, that ancient Chinese warning. It made me think of Debbie Miller. She's written a book called Teaching with Intention, and she talks about defining beliefs and aligning practice. And I think when we do step back and lift our eyes and take some time to think about what do we really believe about education, and are we actually doing this in our classes and across our schools, within our schools and across schools, if we somehow could have the time, create space, I guess, for those conversations within and across schools, I think that would be very meaningful and worthwhile. And also having an attitude that teachers, linked with critical thinking, I think that when we're trying out things, that mistakes are okay, you know, that we try, I think about that a lot when I'm teaching in class, to encourage children to take risks and try things. And I think that that attitude should also be the same for teachers. In terms of children self-assessing, when we're talking about whether or not people are having wall displays where children know about which level they're at, I think for me, what I would rather do is talk with children about more of the specifics. So not my piece of writing is level 2A, but actually it was a really good piece of writing because I started in the moment and the descriptions were really poetic, and what I'm going to work on next is this. So being more specific about what we actually mean by a level 2A piece of writing, for example. And so some questions I'm going to take away and think about are, what makes a socially just education system or society? I think it's broader than just the education system. We've been talking about the wider societal problems and issues. And the other, I wanted to think more about that idea of learning commissions and how we can listen to stakeholders and experts. And finally, I was thinking back to my head who told me not to listen, I think leaders do need to listen. I mean, we all do. And a lot of what people have said today, I think, comes back to listening to experts and that we want those leaders to come and experience the complexities of educating vibrant, unique children. So I'm going to go away and think about that.
Thank you, Amy. I think, it's good to think about what experts can offer our thinking, but the ideal is that we all develop our own sense of being an expert in our work. That should be our ideal. Barry, would you like to go next?
Not particularly.
Okay, come on then.
Thank you. Several years ago, I had a heart problem, and a doctor fixed a pacemaker into my chest, and he assured me that on any occasion when my heart started going slowly, it would kick in and make it go fast. What it doesn't do is it doesn't make your heart, when it's going fast, slow down, as it is at the moment. You're a formidable audience, so well done. One of the things in my job as a professional learning facilitator is the privilege of going into many, many classrooms. And there are people here today whose classrooms I've visited. And it is an honour. And there's fantastic stuff happening in classrooms, and I think one of the things that we've talked about today and heard about today is the danger of losing some of those important things that happen in our classrooms, some of those important learning outcomes. And I thought for a little while that I might talk about the difference between performance and the difference and learning. And some of the work I've done in some schools have been around clarifying with people the difference around a performance orientation and a learning orientation. And those kids who get, and their teachers who get driven by a performance orientation are concerned about achievement and making sure that we know exactly where people are and that they're progressing as fast as possible, etc. And those kids and their teachers who become really interested in a learning orientation become fascinated by how kids make sense of the world. And in one of those privileged moments when I was visiting a classroom, I was watching a science lesson, and a class of about, I guess they were year twos, year threes around there, and they'd been doing something around the moon. And the teacher had asked the kids to find out what they knew in terms of what life would need if you were going to live on the, or what we would need if we were going to live on the moon. And one little boy jumped around and wriggled and threw his hand up and got ignored by the teacher, of course. But nobody else was really offering very much. And this little guy got on a roll and he said, well, the first thing you'd need is a hat, special hat to cover your head. Oh, that's interesting, she said. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, yes, and you'd have to have air in a big tank on your back, and you'd have to have weights to hold you down, and you need a special suit. And she thought, that's excellent. No, that's very good. Anything else? Yes, you need a spear gun and flippers. Now, at that moment, the teacher was about to say, and she stopped, and she said, because what we were doing was actually finding out what kids were thinking and what they were learning. And she said, so why do you think you'd need spear guns and flippers to be on the moon? And he said, well, last Friday we were at the beach having fish and chips, and Dad said, look, there's the moon coming up out of the sea. So, and what we've got to remember is kids will give things a go. And they're not afraid if they are learners. But if they're worried about their performance, they'll hide all that stuff. And I think what we've got to do is, as I think Martin said, and my apologies, Bob, if it was you, that we've got to not be afraid as teachers to be critical thinkers and to think carefully about what we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve that. I think the dilemma that has been well illustrated this afternoon for those of us who want to head down that path, and I think many of us do, is the accountability. So we have accountabilities to our kids in our classroom. We have accountabilities, and I think I see people nodding out there, and I think as classroom teachers, that is the primary accountability. We've got to be honest to those kids and to ourselves. We've got an accountability at a school level to our communities. And then there's this broader accountability, this other thing that we've been discussing this afternoon. And I was particularly interested in Bob's points when he said we should be looking for alternative ways to demonstrate that accountability and not lose our thing. So as we move on into the next 2 days for the conference, I'm particularly looking forward to hearing how we might constructively and positively go about reshaping that kind of environment and space so that we can demonstrate our effectiveness, our accountability, without having to have something like a draconian top-down or vertical system as we've been discussing. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk a bit about my sense of what I've heard today. Those of you, how many of you have been to Canada before? Hands up, great. Yeah, so the situation for teachers in Canada is not really that, dissimilar to what we've heard, what I've heard today. It was a lot like when I got off the plane the other day from Calgary in Auckland. Calgary, the temperature in Auckland was the same. It was 20 degrees, except it was minus 20 degrees in Calgary. So, and David will talk a bit tomorrow, David Berliner will talk a bit about if you think you've got issues, in Canada we've got huge issues, and in Alberta we have a very robust testing program. Children up until this year were expected to write examinations in the course subjects in grades 3, 6, and 9. So, and then by the end of grade 12, which would be 17, 18-year-olds, 50%, half of their mark, would be determined by provincial examinations. So Alberta prides itself as a Canadian jurisdiction that has one of the most robust testing and accountability programs in Canada, if not North America. And David and I debate that all the time, but what is really high-stakes testing. So here's the question I have for you. Just a quick kind of hands up. How many of you have friends or relatives who are adults who are not teachers? Thank you. I just wanted to check the room out here because you're not any different than us. The germ, right? Pastor Solberg's been writing about this for a long time. Here's what I sense from Alberta, and it's taken us some time to get to this realization. The germ infection is not just among educators. It's in all of the professions, and that's what we're seeing in Alberta, in Canada. Police officers right now in Alberta, 30% of their calls are to deal with people with severe psychosocial problems. Okay? Nursing, much the same. Nurses complain, and there's lots of data and studies on this that confirms this, that one of the number one sources of stress for nurses is the paperwork. They're not providing service to patients. And don't get started on doctors. In Canada, the number one source of stress for doctors, are you ready for this one? The number one source of stress for doctors in Canada is, my patients don't listen to my advice. Sound familiar, right? It goes on and on and on. So I guess the point of what I want to share with you today is I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm learning so much. But I guess it's one of those paradoxes, where we're different just like everybody else, right? So the germ is part of the culture. It's part of the DNA of our society, the social meme, if you will. And I think one of the strategic thoughts that we've been muddling over as a teacher association in Alberta and how to deal with the germ, because we've been working with the Finns now for about 3 or 4 years on a partnership program between high schools in Alberta and Finland, is gradually realizing that none of this really has anything to do with education or schools. It has to do with society. It's across all of the silos that we create, and that's one of the challenges. And I really appreciate the presentations today from Martin and Bob. And I'm a great fan of research, and I think myself it's my day job. I'm a research nerd. I love research. I love the debate about PISA. Here's the deal, though. PISA's got its equivalents in all the other professions that I've talked about: policing, healthcare, medicine, you name it. And it's everywhere. And so I think one of the opportunities, and I'm not trying to colonize your conference or say that Alberta has figured anything out, because we certainly haven't, but our federation has been spending a lot more time talking with other professional groups, other unions, other community NGOs to talk about how we can work together to get back to the conversation about what kind of society and what kind of communities we want to create. And that's a real challenge, because teachers are so busy doing the work of teaching. That's why they signed up for teaching. And it's the same, again, in medicine and in policing and you name it. So, this is not anything that people in this audience don't already know, but I think it's something that we tend to forget. We get distracted by the fact that we think that these issues are in fact about us. And it's not about school, it's not about students, it's about what kind of society we want to build. So in Alberta, to give you a bit of context, and then I'll stop because 5 minutes, I'm close to my time. Alberta is really watching what's happening here in New Zealand. Our Minister of Education, who will be coming here in March, has been moving around the province telling everyone about how great everything is in education in New Zealand. You've embraced, seriously, I'm not here as a stand-up comic, okay? It's just wondrous and joyous. You've embraced competencies. You've found out how to do the accountability around that. And one of the challenges that, again, as somebody who works for teachers, is to make sure that we've actually checked out what's really happening in New Zealand. And I've learned so much from you, and I look forward to the conversations in the next couple of days. But one little piece of not advice, because strangers only bring news, they never bring advice, hopefully, is don't think of yourselves as isolated, because you're under a microscope. People are watching what's happening in New Zealand all over the world. I get to travel in my work as a researcher for the Teachers Association in Alberta all over the world. And everywhere I go, I hear about how wonderful New Zealand is and how happy the teachers are. And in Canada, we have a very technical word for that. It's called bullshit. So I'm not sure what you're doing in March, but whatever you're doing, know that many ministers, like our minister, will be coming here, and probably, given his track record, and I'm not trying to give a political message here, be very selective. We have a phrase in Canada, cherry picking, although we can't really grow cherries. We really do have to work together, and looking forward to the conversations over the next couple of days, and thank you for inviting me. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, JC. I mean, the germ has been referred to on a number of occasions today, and you say it's sort of cross-sector, and you've introduced a new academic scientific sort of terminology for it, beginning with BUL. But what we're aware of in New Zealand is that the germ is actually spawning an enormous number of highly infectious bugs. You've got the germ and you've got the bugs, which is the bullshit undermining good schools. You introduced the term, I thought I'd continue it on. Thank you. Yes.
I'm aware it's nearly people's dinner time, so I'll be brief. First of all, I'd like to, my response would be to thank Martin and Bob both for their addresses. And I guess my response to today's presentation is, how did we get to this? How did we get to this bereft view of education that's reduced it to data? And I think the point you made, JC, about this is actually a societal issue. It occurred to me when I was listening, we've moved into a sort of a situation where comparison seems to be the only thing that boosts our identity. And that seems to me to point to a gigantic sort of global insecurity as to who we are and what we're about. So there's lots of questions raised for me from today's presentation, and probably have more questions than answers. But from an educator's point of view, and we are all educators in this room, we have to find ways of preserving what education is actually about. You know, the joy of learning for children, the joy of the arts, the wonder of music, the wonder of history, geography. You cannot reduce that to sets of data. And the day that we do that is the day that we abandon who we are and what we are as educators. And while I really appreciate the work that Martin has done on the RAINS research, I mean, I think it's really important that we know he's given us evidence of the impact of policy, but we also need evidence about what are the drivers of that policy. And I'm not sure that I'm clear what those drivers are. I think they're global, I think they're complex, and they're quite alarming. But what I am sure of is that as educators, if we don't challenge those and debate those and discuss those and really engage in rigorous critique of what policy is delivered to us, then we are also bereft in our responsibility. The other thing that struck me in both Bob and Martin's contribution today is that in one sense, particularly I think Bob's, when he moved into the international level, how far away that is from what actually happens in classrooms. There seems to be this huge disconnect. And Bob, thank you for that sort of three-pronged approach where you talked about the political involvement, the scientific research, and the third one, the professional practice, as being part of policy development. It seems to me, and we discussed this at our table, that that professional practice is the arm that's really missing from informing policy. So I guess the challenge for us is how do we reinsert that professional practice and that professional identity and who we are and what we value and what we care about into policy direction. And it seems to me too that because these are global sort of imperatives, it's almost as though as individuals we kind of think, put our head down, think the saying, you know, raise your head above the cart. It sometimes just seems too big, but it's not too big, and it's something that I think each one of us in our own little way can do something about, and collectively we can be quite powerful, and I guess that's the challenge of this conference. So thank you, Bob and Martin, for your contribution, particularly Martin as a New Zealand academic who is one of, I think, our more courageous academics, and that you're deeply appreciated, Martin. I remember having the privilege of being at Martin's inaugural address when he became professor, and Professor Gerald Grace came out from London, and a phrase he used, and it's always remained with me, when talking about Martin, who he had worked with in London. He said, Martin has the courage to speak the truth to power. And I think that's the imperative for all educators, particularly when children are at the centre of it. And the other thing I want to just mention, Martin, briefly, is a sentence in your report that I think is a critical one that says, and I'll quote it so that I don't misquote it, when careful concern, and I really like those words, careful concern for children and teachers needs to be at the heart of policy. Thank you.
Well, I think that about brings us to a conclusion for the day, unless there is somebody else who would really like to is desperate to, and who believes that everybody else wants to hear them, make a final comment. Judith started off the day saying that the conference should also include some sense of fun and enjoyment. And somebody just mentioned, well, you're going off in your various ways to have dinner tonight. A lot of the day has been about research. A lot of research is about numbers. And I think that we can actually obtain a lot of cautionary advice from what research is. I started off the day by reading from the Dominion. I'm now going to read from a news item from the Lakes District and Central Otago News. For those of you who know Central Otago, you know rabbits and all that sort of stuff. And the header for this news item is A Plague of Carrots. So think now about just the impact and the effect that data can have on us and on our lives and all sorts of other things. The closer we get to the holidays, or just before the holidays, the greater the pressure becomes to take care with drinking, driving, eating, swimming, safe sex, protection from the sun, and all the usual things that social do-gooders thrive on nowadays. Much of this pressure is based on statistics, allegedly proving why we should not do this, that, or not have a bit of this and the next thing. But how about the statistically far greater danger that is posed by carrots? I mean, we've been preoccupied with education, but carrots. This newspaper has conducted research into the insidious vegetable, and the results are quite startling. You need to think about this, what you're going to be eating tonight. Well, in excess of 90% of people who died from a heart attack had eaten carrots at least once in the 10 years preceding their death. All the people who died of cancer ate carrots sometime during their last 10 years of life. All, 100% this is, right at the top of the scale. All of New Zealand's juvenile offenders ate carrots at some stage before, during and after their most recent spate of offending. Just over, a bit lower, but just over 90% of road death victims ate carrots in some form within a 30-day period prior to their death. And every single married and celibate immigrant into New Zealand between the years 1835 and 1895 who ate carrots has died, which is a frightening mortality rate of 100%. We agree with the Carterton North Island scribe F.N. Hayes, who claims that there is a massive cover-up, government cover-up, over the dangers of carrots pose to society. Mr. Hayes, in fact, goes even further and alleges a government conspiracy. He succinctly asks, why else would they, the government, spend millions of dollars feeding carrots to rabbits and possums over the years? We agree with Mr. Hayes. The government should licence all carrot users, confiscate carrots other than those currently being used by licensed operators, and totally ban the growing, importation and sale of all forms of carrots. They're a menace to society, and it's way past time that their dangers were exposed for what they truly are, the highest contributor to mortality in Aotearoa, New Zealand.